At 125 Moscow time on April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin's voice crackled across the radio one final time, and then there was nothing but static. For 17 excruciating minutes, Soviet ground controllers at Baikonur called out to their cosmonaut, waiting for confirmation that the TDU-1 retro-rocket system had fired and begun his descent back to Earth. The confirmation never came. Orbital tracking stations reported what the men in the control room refused to believe. Vostok 1 remained locked in its elliptical path, circling the planet at 28,000 kilometers per hour with no sign of deorbit. Gagarin, the young pilot selected from over 3,000 Soviet Air Force candidates, the pride of Sergei Korolev's secretive design bureau, was trapped. The morning had begun in triumph. Launch from Baikonur Cosmodrome at 9:07 proceeded flawlessly. Gagarin's cheerful transmissions, "I feel fine, I can see the clouds," had already been transcribed for Radio Moscow's historic announcement. But what no one knew at that moment, what wouldn't surface for decades in declassified engineering reports, would change the trajectory of human spaceflight itself. The Vostok capsule's automatic systems, designed because Soviet engineers distrusted manual pilot control during re-entry, had failed at the critical moment, and there was no backup. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. 12 hours after launch, the Kremlin faced an impossible choice. TASS had prepared two announcements, one celebrating humanity's first spaceflight, another acknowledging failure to be released only if Western tracking stations detected the disaster first. By evening, American radar installations had already noted the anomaly. Vostok 1's orbit was decaying, but not quickly enough. It would take days, perhaps weeks, for atmospheric drag to bring the capsule down, long after its life support systems had been exhausted. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who had staked Soviet prestige on space achievements since Sputnik's triumph in October 1957, demanded answers that Sergei Korolev could not provide. The chief designer, whose identity remained classified from the Soviet public, stood before party officials defending engineering decisions made under impossible timelines. At 2200 Moscow time, TASS released a statement of devastating brevity. A cosmonaut had perished during a high-altitude test flight. No name, no details, no admission that he had reached orbit at all. Western intelligence knew better. American tracking stations had logged every pass of Vostok 1 overhead. Within hours, reconnaissance analysts confirmed what Moscow had tried to obscure. The first human in space was dead, his capsule slowly spiraling toward an ocean grave. 3,000 miles away in Washington, President John F. Kennedy absorbed the news with a mixture of horror and cold calculation. He had been in office less than 3 months. The Bay of Pigs disaster was days away from further testing his administration, and now his advisors presented him with an unexpected opportunity wrapped in tragedy. NASA Administrator James Webb had spent weeks arguing for methodical progress over accelerated spectacle. The Soviet catastrophe vindicated every cautionary memo he had written. Kennedy quietly shelved the aggressive lunar timetables his staff had been drafting, the ones designed to match whatever the Soviets achieved next. There would be no reckless response. Alan Shepard's Freedom 7 flight proceeded on May 5, 1961, after extensive additional safety reviews that delayed launch by 72 hours. When his Mercury capsule splashed down in the Atlantic after a successful 15-minute suborbital arc, the achievement was celebrated not as catching up to the Soviets, but as something more valuable, American caution rewarded. Shepard emerged from the capsule alive. That alone now seemed revolutionary. In Moscow, accountability had a different meaning. Kremlin hardliners demanded someone answer for the humiliation. Korolev, protected by his anonymity from public disgrace, could not be shielded from internal recrimination. The Central Committee established a review board stacked with his rivals from competing design bureaus, men who had long resented his monopoly on crude spaceflight resources. Korolev survived, but survival came at a price. Direct control of the Vostok program transferred to a committee structure that diluted his authority. Vladimir Chelomey, an engineer with better political connections, received substantial funding increases for his own spacecraft designs. The unified vision that had produced Sputnik and nearly produced triumph with Gagarin fractured into competing fiefdoms. The consequences of this organizational chaos would prove catastrophic for Soviet ambitions. But first, there was the matter of redemption, or its attempt. On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress. The speech he delivered bore little resemblance to the one history might have recorded. There was no call to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Instead, Kennedy proposed what he called a measured journey toward lunar exploration, to be achieved with safety and certainty before 1975. The rhetoric was deliberately restrained. Kennedy spoke of engineering excellence rather than beating the Soviets. He invoked the memory of Gagarin, not by name but unmistakably, warning against the tragedy that haste invites. Congress approved substantial NASA budget increases, but the framing had shifted. This was no longer a race. It was a demonstration of competence. Wernher von Braun, the Marshall Space Flight Center director who had dreamed of moon missions since his youth, accepted the extended timeline with characteristic pragmatism. More time meant larger rockets, more redundancy, fewer compromises. The Saturn program would proceed, but it would proceed carefully. German Titov had trained alongside Gagarin. He had been the backup, separated from his friend by selection committee deliberations that had weighed their nearly identical qualifications. Now he carried the burden of Soviet redemption, but redemption would wait. The Vostok redesign consumed 16 months of engineering work. Every automatic system underwent review. Manual override capabilities, once dismissed as unnecessary risk, became mandatory. When Titov finally launched in August 1962, his 17-orbit mission succeeded without incident, yet the world's reaction was muted. The Soviets had proven they could match what the Americans had already accomplished months earlier with John Glenn's orbital flight. The mystique was gone. Soviet space achievements, once heralded as proof of communist superiority, now seemed merely equivalent. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed: Moscow's announcement that crewed lunar missions were not a priority for Soviet science. The race Khrushchev had never officially acknowledged entering was being quietly abandoned. The years that followed rewarded patience over ambition. NASA's Gemini program, conceived as a bridge between Mercury and Apollo, proceeded through 10 crewed missions without a single fatality. Each flight tested rendezvous techniques, spacewalk capabilities, and long-duration spaceflight effects with methodical precision. There were close calls. Gemini 8's thruster malfunction nearly killed Neil Armstrong and David Scott, but the safety margins held. The Soviet program told a different story. Underfunding and bureaucratic infighting produced delays that compounded upon themselves. The Soyuz spacecraft, intended to carry cosmonauts to the moon, remained grounded by technical problems that adequate resources might have solved. Korolev's death in January 1966, during surgery complicated by years of stress and overwork, removed the one figure capable of unifying the fractured program. By 1969, when American engineers had originally hoped to achieve a lunar landing, Apollo was still conducting Earth orbital tests. No one complained. The alternative bodies in spacecraft, families in mourning, remained too recent a memory. Apollo 17 touched down in the Taurus-Littrow Valley on March 3, 1972. Commander Eugene Cernan descended the ladder and spoke words heard by millions: "We came in peace, and we came carefully." The global television audience was smaller than it might have been. 11 years had passed since Gagarin's death. The Cold War had found other arenas for competition. Young viewers who had grown up with regular spaceflight updates treated lunar missions as impressive, but expected achievements, engineering problems solved rather than human drama unfolding. Yet something had been gained in the slower journey. 5 successful moon landings preceded Apollo 17, each building on lessons from the last. No American astronaut had died in space. No Soviet cosmonaut had perished since that April morning in 1961. The moon bore bootprints from 12 explorers who had all returned home to their families. Historians would later debate whether the cautious path had cost humanity momentum, whether bolder timelines might have established permanent lunar bases by the 1980s, or reached Mars by century's end. But in control rooms at Houston and Baikonur, engineers who remembered the static on Gagarin's final transmission measured success differently. Every mission that ended with a safe splashdown was victory enough. Sometimes the greatest achievement is simply bringing everyone home.